F1 is back in Australia 3 years on from the last race at Albert Park, and Formula 1 has changed so much in that time, with new regulations, a new world champion, and a new rivalry at the front. But it was Leclerc putting in a dominant performance in Australia as he looked so comfortable at the front, and his main rival failed to finish once again. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Australian Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. On another level. It's difficult not to start this video by talking about our race winner, Charles Leclerc, and he put in an excellent race leading from start to finish. It was so dominant that we didn't even see Leclerc on the TV feed for most of the race. Following each of the safety cars, Leclerc built out another big lead from Verstappen, as it didn't take long for the Ferrari driver to break the DRS range and then canter off into the distance. It was made possible by the fact that he took the pole position by almost 0.3 of a second from the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. Once he managed to secure that lead spot off the line, he never really looked like losing out, especially once Verstappen pulled over on lap 39. It was the easiest Grand Prix victory I can remember for Charles Leclerc, as he was so dominant in Australia. And with 2 of his main competitors behind him retiring, the Monegasque driver has taken a commanding lead in the championship after 3 races, with his closest rival now being George Russell in the Mercedes. And at the same time, Leclerc has more than double the points of Sainz and Verstappen, who are probably his closest rivals over the course of the season. The worrying thing for me is that this could turn into an unassailable lead as that gap expands ever further. But focusing on this race, it was so comfortable for Leclerc that he didn't even respond to Red Bull's decision to pit Verstappen slightly earlier and attempt the undercut, with Ferrari confidently choosing instead to stick with their strategy and give themselves a shorter stint on the hard compound tyre. There isn't much else to say about Leclerc's race other than he will be ecstatic, internally at least, that his 2 closest rivals failed to finish at Albert Park. So it was obviously a green box for Charles Leclerc after he comfortably took the victory with the fastest lap and a Grand Slam in Australia. Another power unit disaster for Red Bull powertrains. It's 3 races, 2 retirements, and a race win for Max Verstappen so far this season, and it was another power unit related issue for Red Bull powertrains. It's starting to feel that it's all or nothing for Red Bull, as they have once again had issues with what looked like their power unit. It means that all 4 drivers have seen issues, with Tsunoda and Gasly taking the brunt of the problem so far this season, and that fire for Verstappen today looked like it was at risk of losing the engine, hence his urgency in getting the fire extinguished. Time will tell on whether it can be recovered, but regardless, the transition from Honda to Red Bull made power units and the transition to a new type of fuel this season hasn't gone as smoothly as they would have wanted, and this is costing them the chance of competing for world championships as things stand at the moment. The fact that Red Bull are in a position where at some races they have the fastest car on track is impressive to say the least, after they managed last year's and this year's car developments through 2021. But they are letting their drivers down with these power unit related issues. It's the kind of issue that, if not resolved, will cause them problems later in the season, with potential grid drops from power unit replacements. Verstappen was easily on track for a 2nd place finish this weekend, which is probably the best position he could have hoped for from the race, as the Ferrari was well and truly in a league of its own. But once again, he failed to finish, and so he will rightly be frustrated after these reliability issues. It would be naive to write the Dutch driver off, as he's certainly capable of stringing a series of race wins together, and it just takes a couple of reliability issues on the Ferrari side to bring him right back into the competition. So it can be nothing but a red box for the Red Bull team for yet another reliability issue that's ultimately cost them at least 36 points for Max Verstappen in the 3 races so far. This kind of situation cannot become the norm, and they need to get this sorted as soon as possible, or they risk of ending up losing out to Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship, as they now sit 10 points behind the Silver Arrows. But before we take a look at Carlos Sainz's poor weekend, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 50,000 subscribers by the summer break, so if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my videos this year. Thanks. A weekend to forget for Sainz. It was a tricky weekend for Carlos Sainz after the first couple of races this year where he'd been on the podium but had struggled to match his teammate. He was on the back foot once again in Australia. His qualifying session was impeded by the red flag triggered by Fernando Alonso's off, and as a result, Sainz lost out on what could have been a lap to get him onto the front row of the grid, or at least put him in the mix with his teammate and the Red Bulls. In the end, after the restart of Q3, the team couldn't even start his car, meaning he lost out on 3 minutes of valuable preparation time. Those 3 minutes put the Spaniard under more pressure, as he wasn't able to use his outlap to warm up his tyres enough to get himself further up the grid than the 9th place that he started. Things then just got worse for Sainz as he opted to start on the hard compound tyre and had a dreadful start as he got bogged down at the launch and lost positions left, right and centre on that opening lap. I guess he'd failed to warm up that hard tyre going into the race. It seemed like with every move Sainz made to try and gain a position resulted in him dropping further down the order, until on lap 2 he ended up off into the gravel and out of the race. He just put in a really quick middle sector on the second lap, so perhaps he pushed too much to try and regain some of those positions, but it only resulted in him going into the gravel and out of the race. The situation he was in at the start was basically out of his control, with the team having to put him on the hard tyres to give him a differential strategy that might give him an opportunity with a long first stint. But it's the 3rd race in a row now where he hasn't quite been able to match his teammates' pace, and with the fight between Verstappen and Leclerc seeming to be on at every single race, I expect Sainz is at risk of ending up becoming a second driver in this championship if his luck doesn't change soon. It's a weekend to forget, as the Spanish driver couldn't quite get anything hooked up in Melbourne, but it's a long season, and there are many more races to go, and with developments on the way for all of the teams, there will certainly be more opportunities for Sainz. So for this weekend of bad luck, I'm going to give Sainz an amber box, as it was completely out of his control, but ultimately he couldn't get anything right this weekend either. McLaren's rapid progression. This weekend saw a huge leap forward for the McLaren team. It was a reminder of just how quick that car was back at the first test in Barcelona, before the brake duct issues that the team struggled with at the races in the Middle East. Both drivers looked so much more comfortable with their car this weekend, having used the Bahrain race as a bit of a test, and then seeing some improvements in Jeddah. But this weekend was brilliant. Lando Norris topped FP3, which means absolutely nothing, but looks amazing when you consider just how far off the pace they were at the first race in particular. In qualifying, Norris put in an excellent lap to get ahead of Mercedes and take a spot on the second row of the grid, and then Ricciardo was just a few spots back in 7th. So not only was it a great step forward, it was looking like a car that both drivers could get the most out of. It was always a comment from the pundits at the testing that the McLaren car wasn't struggling as much as some of its rivals with the porpoising problems. And this has been the first race where they've shown their true pace. And with the next race in Imola, we might see it again in the cooler conditions where their braking issues weren't so bad. In the race, the McLarens ran close together, just behind the Mercedes cars, and they had decent race pace. Once again, both of their drivers were looking comfortable in the car, and they brought home a solid double points finish of 5th and 6th, with a great haul of 18 points. It puts McLaren back in a great spot, with them getting back to 4th in the championship, where many expected them to be before the start of the season. With this progression, they could continue to make steps forward and start to compete with those 3 teams ahead of them. So with that result, it's clearly a green box for McLaren after a brilliant improvement from the first couple of weekends. The team are getting there, and if they keep this up, who knows, it could even be a 4-way fight at the front through the season. Alpine's opportunity missed. It was an encouraging weekend for Alpine, with Alonso in particular showing that he had some great pace and could potentially get himself in the mix for pole position on Saturday. However, hydraulics issue meant he failed to get through turn 13 in Q3, as he couldn't drop the gears and failed to get the car slowed down enough. It was a gutting moment after he'd put in the fastest middle sector of anyone in qualifying. He had a real chance at being up there and competing with the top teams for the first time since he returned to Formula 1. But a 10th place start and a decision to go for the hard tyres from the off left him stranded early on, and then a strategy where he gambled on being able to pit later than some of the others left him with a medium tyre that looked like it gave up almost immediately on that Alpine car, and forced him to take a second stop, and as a result, he was the final finisher in this race. It was a weekend of what could have been for the Spanish driver, as with a more reliable power unit, he could have easily been up there and competing with the top teams in the sport. Meanwhile, Esteban Ocon was never really able to match the pace of his teammate, with 8th on the grid and 7th at the finish, gaining from Verstappen's failure ahead of him. It was a good weekend, but not a great weekend, and the team will be frustrated by the fact that they lost out with reliability in the end. It's not been a great start for that Renault power unit, as this year they push for performance-related improvements rather than reliability ones, before the start of the engine freeze. It looks like a competitive engine, but not a reliable one, and they might be facing grid shops in the not too distant future at this rate. So it's got to be a red box for Alpine, as they failed to capitalise on a car that had some great pace this weekend. Hopefully they'll be able to bring it back in the next few races. Honourable mentions. A couple of honourable mentions this week, and first up, Alex Albon deserves a mention for scoring his first point since returning to Formula 1, making an interesting strategy work, pitting on the penultimate lap after running for so long on the hard tyre. It was deserved for Williams and a great job from Albon. And I have to say that Lance Stroll was actually very close to getting a red box for a pretty disappointing weekend. He caused the odd crash with Latifi in qualifying as he barely looked at his mirrors before coming across on the Williams driver. In the race, he got a penalty for weaving on the straights, and his defensive move on Valtteri Bottas in turn 3 was noted by the stewards. So it was a disappointing performance from Stroll, and that really cost Aston Martin this weekend. But on the whole, I think we can say that the racing in Melbourne was improved with the new regulations and track changes. As always, make sure you let me know what I missed in the comment section, and thanks very much for watching.